announced. Thank you, Ashish and Ajay. And with that, we turn it over to the men whom we will want most before and after the budget, the tax gurus. Joining us now, Dinesh Kanabar, the CEO at Dhruva Advisors, Sudhir Kapadia, National Tax Leader at EY, and Rajeev Dimri, the National Head of Tax at KPMG. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Sudhir, let me start with you. Direct tax, will we get anything?
If we don't get anything, that is a blessing.
Okay.
I think the economic survey gives some indication, an acknowledgement that the fiscal space for the government has never been better. I don't remember a budget where the target set in the business the budget estimate was actually met. It will probably be met with a margin. So I think that's the good news. Given the fiscal space, it would be interesting to see if all the other commentary on addressing inequality, the Piketty school of thought, etc., which comes up every time when there is a budget on the anvil, I don't think there will be a need for government, in my view, this year to address some of those issues through fiscal policy. So I think the good news as far as I am concerned, which I am expecting, is, as I said, no increase in tax rates.
Okay.
Corporate tax rates have already been addressed sufficiently, in my view. I don't think there is any need or any room for changes. Personal tax has been discussed, the usual, standard deductions, etc. The one point which has come up is the simpler personal tax scheme, which has not found many takers. We can expect some tweaks there to make it more attractive.
Okay. Mr. Kanabar, good morning. And that was my next question, because, at the end of the day, for a lot of us, it all boils down to personal taxes, right? So do you think there could be some relaxation, either the basic limit going up or perhaps more reductions for ATC, insurance? Any of these could be on the anvil?
Three things on the personal tax, which I think might be very, very important. First is that we have a peak rate of tax of 43%. And while it impacts very, very few people, when you start putting tax rates at above 40%, you are really not keeping things simple, because then people will want to try and see whether they can plan around that 43%. And I think that's something which really needs to be looked at, number one. Number two, you mentioned about standard deduction, and obviously standard deduction is something which actually, according to me, should be on an index, so that we don't have to revisit year in, year out. On the COVID front, I think the one issue which is coming up is that work from home is becoming a reality. And if people are going to be sitting home and working and they are given an allowance, whether it is to meet the bandwidth cost or whatever else, those should not be treated as a perquisite and should be tax deductible in the hands of the employer. And that's indeed a very, very big ask and should happen. And if I may just take the liberty of just going back for a minute to the corporate tax part, and I thought Sudhir made a good point about robustness of collection. So we are seeing two things. We are seeing a 24% enhancement of corporate tax collections. We are seeing GST wherever it is. And I think what the government can really do this time is to bring stability. And this is not just an empty wish list which happens every year before the budget. Just before we came on, I was hearing about private spending not picking up, capital expenditure not picking up. And the government has brought about a 15% rate of tax for new manufacturing companies. The question is, if that comes to a sunset in 23, many of the corporates have got impacted and not been able to set up projects because of COVID, etc. Can we push that back to 25 or make it really an open thing, number one? Number two, if you believe that manufacturing and it should be taxed at 15%, there are other segments of the economy which you want to promote, whether it is green energy, whether it is anything else that you want to promote. Would you want to tax them at that 15% rate? And the final thing, and again, this comes up every year, but I do wish the government does look at it, which is dispute resolution. We have ongoing litigation and we need to find ways, and means it's already there in the draft of the direct taxes code. I would wish some of it gets implemented.
Okay.
Sir, Mr. Kanabar, since we're talking about corporate taxes and how the government can, give some sort of tax concessions in order to boost growth, I'm sure something must be done to boost employment as well, right? Especially skilled employment. We were talking about how urban unemployment levels have crossed 9% as of December 2021. What can be done there? One of the suggestions someone was telling us earlier about is increase the threshold under Section 80 JJAA from 25,000 per month to 75,000 per month. Do you think that's a realistic assumption? And what else can be done to generate skilled employments from the corporate end?
So indeed, increasing that level would be a welcome thing. But the point which I earlier made is that if you are going to bring down the corporate rate of tax to 15% for new manufacturing companies, and you see a capex cycle, would that itself not be something very important? Because the more investment happens, the more manufacturing companies come. That's where you're going to see employment being generated. So one is to incentivize, but other is really to go back and say, we need a capex cycle. The more the capex, the more we are on the Atmanirbhar path, the more we will have manufacture in India. And the more that manufacturing happens, there will be more employment. One other point, and I don't think this has been discussed anywhere, so I just want to table it. Yesterday, probably you would be aware that UAE for the first time introduced corporate tax, 9%, very modest tax. That is a follow-on from the BEPS, OECD BEPS suggestion. And it'll be interesting to see what does India do in terms of BEPS and what issues are put up on digital taxation. There are two issues. One is attribution of profits, where India provides a market, which is going to be very, very critical. And how, if Indian corporates have invested overseas and are taxed at less than 15%, will they be subjected to a residual tax in India? Both will be very, very interesting, and the approach that the government takes would be interesting to see.
That's an interesting point, and we'd want others to comment as well. But let me get in Mr. Rajeev Dimri, National Head of Tax at KPMG, who's waiting by as well. Mr. Dimri, good to have you here. Your first take on what broad expectations are, top-down, and specifically from a capital markets taxation point of view, is there anything we should expect?
Thank you for having me. Let me start by saying that if there was ever a time really to introduce some feel-good factor, given the environment in which we are and the way that the tax collections have behaved, which is all now documented, I think this is a time to create some feel-good factor. And which obviously means that there should be no attempt to increase any rates or anything, because this may not be the right time to do it. If at all, measures should be there to give some incentive, whether it is on individuals towards COVID relief or for corporates towards COVID relief, or rationalization of disputes, of some sort of permanent mechanism. I think those things have really helped companies, the interventions that have happened in the recent past. So at the macro level, if at all there was a time, and this has nothing to do with whether we are in some sort of election time or not, I think looking at the environment, enhancing the consumption, some feel-good factors for companies as well as individuals is definitely needed. On the capital side, the question that you asked, I mean, that has been a debate that's been going on for a while. That should we be having too many differentiation in different ways in which you calculate long-term capital assets, gains that you calculate. So should there be some sort of parity that should be brought about? It's possible that some of those rationalization measures that can happen and would be welcome, but certainly there should be no incremental taxes in any form or shape that should come about in this budget. If at all, existing taxes should get rationalized, particularly on the equalization levy, digital taxes. I think there is some work that needs to be done to make sure that India is not an outlier in many of the ways in which we treat transactions in India.
Okay. Well, I think the 15% for corporates and 43% for individuals, even some individuals, most of us perhaps 33%. I think I'll blow my top if they decrease it for corporates and increase it for, or even keep the difference as well. I mean, it's really unfair. Okay, anyway, let's wait and see. Mr. Dimri, just a last word, running out of time. Anything for startups? Because that's something, that's the lot the Prime Minister first meant.
I mean, that request, demand, or the need has been around for a while, for many years. There are, measures. So right now, the tax laws, while they've made attempts, at least in the income tax side, they have made attempts to differentiate startups. No attempt has been made at all on the indirect tax side. In fact, I've said this before, that today anything that is digital has a higher burden of compliance, particularly on the indirect tax side. So on one hand, we do want to move towards more digital. On the other hand, not the activity, but the medium. So long as my delivery medium is digital, I'm exposed to more taxes and more compliance. I think that itself is something that ought to be relooked at. It's almost like the government, particularly on the indirect taxes, is delegating all compliance and enforcement onto the companies. And I think that has gone a little bit further than what it should be. So on the startup side, whether it is on the tax allowances and other things, but the compliance burden, remember, these are companies that are starting up. These are the companies that might not have all the facilities in place already, who are casting a burden of compliance, is something that has to be relooked at.
Okay. We could have gone on, but out of time, and there are some guests waiting from the CII. So, Mr. Kanabar, Mr. Dimri, and Mr. Kapadia, thank you very much for prepping us up for what usually is the most important part of the budget, what it says on taxes. We're going to take a quick break, and as I just said, a very special CII panel is lined up. We're going to be joined by Mr. T.V. Narendran, President CII, Sanjeev Bajaj, President Designate CII, and Rajiv Memani, the Head of National Committee of Taxation at the CII. Back in a jiffy.